recording now. Just FYI for everybody. And a little bit about my personal philosophy on teaching people how to begin their birdwatching process, or what it will be a lifelong journey for you, is that I'm not going to tell you this is a Bohemian waxwing for X, Y, and Z reason. I'm going to try to give you all the tools that you'll need to arrive at that identification yourself. So I'm going to teach you all to fish rather than giving you the fish, so to speak. A little bit about the organization that I work for. How long do I expect tonight's class to last? It'll probably be slightly longer than an hour is how it was running when I practiced it earlier, but it'll also depend on the number of questions and stuff like that that come in. So we'll try to get right through it. But a little bit about the foundation. So we are actually in our 30th year. So we've been serving the Jacksonville community for about 30 years. Advancing wildlife conservation through science, collaboration, and a community of wonderful volunteers, which includes a lot of you here present tonight. So this is a group of the 5 of us. We are a small but mighty team. I'll just leave it at that. A little bit about our programming. We started off in 1993 with our Give Wildlife a Break program aimed at reducing roadkill on the roadways around Jackson. We used to do that through a program of signage. You've probably seen our signs around town, but more recently we've moved to helping agency partners implement mitigation like wildlife crossing structures, underpasses, and overpasses. We also have our wildlife friendlier fencing program. So that's a program where we remove obsolete fence from the landscape to increase the landscape permeability and reduce wildlife mortality. So that's another really fun way to get involved with the organization. If you want to come help us out on a fence project, it's a tangible way to make a difference for wildlife. Another program we have is called Bearwise Jacksonville. It's a 4-way partnership with a bunch of agencies, and we are the nonprofit in the partnership. So we're seeking to reduce conflict with bears in Teton County, Wyoming in this program. And then the program I'm the most responsible for is called Nature Mapping Jackson Hole. Many of you are trained nature mappers, so thanks for being here tonight. But if you want to get involved with nature mapping, you can send me an email. You all have my email. You can take a training, and then you can contribute to our citizen science database. We have a bunch of projects. So if you're a trained nature mapper, you can do mountain bluebird nest box monitoring. You can come participate as a volunteer at our MAPS bird banding stations. You can participate in Snake River floats. You can do Moose Day with us, and you can become a trained nature mapper. So if you're not a trained nature mapper now, I'd highly encourage you to email me and sign up for a training so that you can contribute to helping land and wildlife management agencies understand what's happening on the landscape. It's wildlife. So jumping into the presentation, here's a little bit about me. Here I am at 2 years old. There's my dad. He's probably feeding those laughing gulls off the back of a boat off the coast of North Carolina, probably. So I started young. Here I am at 16 in the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C., examining the specimens of some extinct birds there. This is me during a study abroad in college in some funky beach attire. So I would never be seen in a swimsuit at the beach. I've only been seen at the beach with binoculars around my neck. Here I am during college at a field job. I worked on the Mogollon Rim in northern Arizona doing a nest searching job there. Here I am on the morning of my college graduation doing nothing else than birding on that important day. Here's my dad and I, both adults now, still doing the same thing we were doing when I was 2, looking at gulls, this time in California. Here I am at a job I did after college, 8,000 feet in the Big Belt Mountains, Montana, surveying for golden eagles at a migration hawk watch there. This is Western Idaho, trapping raptors with the Intermountain Bird Observatory over in Boise. And this is on top of Miller Butte. A couple of years ago, you probably recognize that. I think this was actually July, but it was already really smoky. And we were up there trapping bluebirds on the top of Miller Butte. So that's where I currently am. So most of you know this about me, maybe some don't, but the only thing you really need to know about me is that I love birds and that I'm a birder. And I've been that way my whole life, and I hope to inspire some of you to take that journey too. So this is just a brief overview of tonight's topics. We're going to go over kind of the tools you'll need to get started, and then some of the aspects of bird identification, such as visual, auditory, and what I like to call the holistic approach to bird ID. And then we'll go over some appreciation and ethics, and then I will send you like Buzz Lightyear to infinity and beyond. So getting started, we'll just talk about some of the tools that we need and where you might be able to find some birds. So you're going to need some optics. If you want to really get into enjoying birds, binoculars are highly recommended. I like the 8x42 magnification. The 8 there speaks to the amount of magnification. So some people will do 10x42s, but once you start getting into those higher magnifications, it can be really hard to find the bird in the binoculars when you raise them up. So I really recommend sticking with either 8 or 10x42s for bird watching. Those are the best magnifications. You can get some pretty good quality binoculars for $250 to $280. I would recommend spending at least that price tag when you're getting started, because if you spend, say, you know, $50 or $100 on some really cheap binoculars, you're just going to find yourself down the road wanting something a little bit higher quality, and you're going to end up spending that money anyway. So start off with something around that $200 price range. These are highly recommended, as well as Vortex. And don't cheap out now. You can, you know, these are the higher end binoculars that I will probably never own. But yeah, at least that $250 price tag, I think, is the point here. Spawning scopes are another tool you might end up using if you get into the hobby. Now this allows for a greater magnification, so you can look at things that are a little bit farther away. Great for scanning mud flats for shorebirds, or lakes for distant waterfowl, raptors at great distances. But you are going to need a tripod as well, and the price tag on these can be a bit more hefty than it is for a simple pair of binoculars. So, you know, consider your investment in your hobby before you start spending a lot of money on it, you know, is what I would recommend. But this is the scope that I have. It's really great. Vortex is a good company. They have this lifetime warranty. So if you run over your scope with your car, they will give you a brand new scope essentially for free. So that's a good brand. A camera is another really good tool that you can use for birding. It can be used for documenting rare species when you see them, so that there's kind of evidence that that species was there at that date and time. But they can also be used for identification. So say you saw something in the field that you didn't know what it was, but you took a photo of it, and then you came back and you could look at your field guide and compare your photos in the field guide, or send the photos to an expert or something like that. So that can be a really helpful way to use a camera. They are expensive, but there are a range of options. But one thing you are going to need is something with a good zoom. So something like 300mm plus is going to be ideal for bird photography. And then these are some of the options. You can get a point and shoot bridge camera. This is a fixed lens, so it doesn't come off, but it still zooms in and out. I know a lot of people that have this camera and get really nice pictures with it. DSLR is the camera type that I use. I do not use my camera for artistic purposes. I use my camera only to document rare birds that I find, but my camera works fine for this, and it has a detachable lens, so you can put a bigger or smaller lens on this camera. And then there are the newish mirrorless cameras, which I don't know anything about, but I know a lot of people that have these cameras and produce really excellent photographs with them. So a bunch of options there that you can consider if you like animals or like photography. You are probably going to need a field guide. So this was the standard back in 1966. It's a bit of an antique now, so maybe a little bit heftier of a price tag, but the golden guide is where many of us started. This is where I started, with the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds of North America. I started when it was in its probably second edition, was super stoked when the third edition came out. And then the Sibley Guide to Birds came out, and I no longer use the National Geographic Guide because this has become the standard for bird identification in North America. So I highly recommend the Sibley Guide to Birds. They do have a smaller guide. So the Sibley Guide is pretty hefty. It's large to carry into the field, but there are East and West guides. Now, of course, you know, if you buy the Western guide and then you're taking a trip to Florida, you're going to have to get something else. So I typically tell people to buy the full guide or, you know, one of each of the smaller guides for those purposes, but highly recommend the Sibley Guide to Birds. So your smartphone is also a very important tool that you can use in birding. So we'll start off with using the phone as a camera. We all know that most of our phones have cameras. You can use those phones to take photos of birds. And we all know, you know, when we just use our camera to take a picture, it's this grainy thing that doesn't show any detail. But if you hold your phone up to your binoculars or your spotting scope, you can get a pretty decent photo. You know, this is definitely not it's nothing that's award winning, but it's a high quality image where you can definitely identify the northern goshawk that's in the photo. So digibending or digiscoping are the words used for this. Is where you take a digital photograph through your binoculars or taking a digital photograph through your spotting scope. So this is one I took in my yard in Victor last year of a goshawk through my binoculars. So this is digiscoping. I took this image through my scope. These are two ducks at Teton Springs. They're actually goldeneyes, and we have two different species of goldeneye here. Now, here's your first identification tip of the day. There's a common goldeneye here on the left and a Barrow's goldeneye here on the right. So the easy way to tell these two species apart is that the common goldeneye has that circular white spot on its face versus the crescent shaped marking on the Barrow's goldeneye. So, but you can see in this photo, these two birds are sleeping. Nonetheless, we can still tell the difference based on the extent of the white on this bird. So it's a much whiter overall looking bird, even coming up onto that wing. It's kind of the white pattern with thin black stripes on it. Versus the Barrow's goldeneye here is a much more blackish bird in the wings and the back with these kind of white spots on it. And you can see even in this poor digiscope, the difference between these two birds. Here's another one that I took last year in the Teton Valley. So at first glance, we have here a bunch of trumpeter swans and then, you know, a pretty common species in the Teton Valley. But when we zoom in on this image, we see that there is an imposter in the group. This is a tundra swan is what these are called. And you can tell it's that because it has a thin yellow marking right there in its floor. It's also slightly smaller. The bill shape is slightly more concave on this bird. So these are a little bit more rare. So I took this photo to document the presence of the more rare species and with this group of the common species. Smartphones can also be used to record audio. So a lot of times birds will make sounds and we'll never see them. So they can be hard to identify when we don't know what that sound is. But if you take your phone and make a recording of that bird, then you could come back to your computer later and try to figure it out or send it to an expert and they can help you figure it out. So that can be a really great and useful way to use your phone as a birding tool. These are the recommendations for the settings that Cornell puts out. So these are the best kind of settings that you can use. I use Voice Record Pro to record bird sounds because you are able to edit in the settings to these specifications. And there are Android apps as well that are modifiable. So I really like to go into the field and record birds. It's one of my favorite pastimes, and I would encourage you, you know, if you're hearing something that you don't know, to just take a simple recording of that bird and then send it along to me or someone else who can help you ID it. So a smartphone can also be used as a field guide. So we spoke about the Sibley Guide to Birds earlier. This is the Sibley app, which is also a guide, but it's on your phone. Then you don't have to lug that big guide into the field. It has all 900 species that are present in North America in the app. And this is a kind of what it looks like when you'll enter into one of the species. You'll have these nice, you know, his nice plates, the paintings that he's done, and then a verbal description of the sound, habits, you know, a little bit of information on the size and stuff. And then what I really like is if you click this little double arrow here, you can actually compare two similar species. So here we have the savanna sparrow and the vesper sparrow, two superficially similar species when we might see them. But we'll notice that here on the vesper sparrow, it has this much more bright and contrasting marking around the auricular there. This is a much duller facial marking on this species. And then that chestnut color, the chestnut colored epaulet there on the vesper sparrow. But the best way to tell a vesper sparrow is when it flies up in front of your vehicle as you're driving along, you'll see those white outer tail feathers on the vesper sparrow. The savanna sparrow doesn't have that. So a lot of us in the class probably know about Merlin. I know that some of you have been using Merlin because you'll say, oh, I used Merlin to do this or that. That's great. Merlin is an awesome tool. I'll kind of step you through how it can be used, but you can do a bird ID. So it'll tell you kind of what's expected in that area and at that time. But we're going to look at the photo ID. So photo ID can be used, you can take a photo through your scope or your binoculars right then and there, or you can choose a photo. So you can take a photo with your DSLR, whatever camera you have, and then upload that later. Once you've uploaded that, you can put in a date and time and a place, and then it'll suggest things. So this is an artificial intelligence software that's kind of helping you to come along to an identification here. Top species is usually what it is predicting that it is, but then it'll give several other, it could be this, this, or this. So as with any artificial intelligence or any, technological tool that we're using, I would encourage people to be smart about it. So Merlin's great. It can be really helpful, but it's not foolproof and it's not accurate 100% of the time. In this case, it did accurately identify the northern goshawk photo that I've uploaded here. But say it had put the shrike on the top. We're not just going to want to say, oh, Merlin says it's a shrike. We want to look at those photos and see, do the photos line up? We can see, the goshawk has that white supercilium there that's obviously in this picture as well. It looks more closely to the goshawk. So just always use your critically thinking brain when you're going through the Merlin AI. So the sound ID is similar. You can sit there in the field and record a bird that's singing, or you can upload a sound recording that you did earlier. I really like to use this. So like kind of looking at the sound ID when I'm in the field. It'll listen for birds, and when a bird sings, you'll be able to see the spectrogram of the sound visually represented right there in real time, which is really cool. And then it'll tell you what it thinks is there. So the red-breasted nuthatch here is this lower frequency sound that it's picking up here, and it's correct. That is a red-breasted nuthatch. And then the mountain chickadee are these higher frequency sounds over here. Now, again, I've seen Merlin call out some crazy things. So we don't just want to say, well, Merlin said this was here or that was there. That is not the right way to use the tool. The right way to use the tool is to say, oh, Merlin is saying there's a red-breasted nuthatch in the area. I'm going to look and see if I can find that bird and verify that that is in fact what it is. It's a great tool to help you learn bird sounds and, kind of get a concept of what is in the area. But it's definitely not something where you should be like putting into nature mapping red-breasted nuthatches and mountain chickadees every time Merlin says that that's what's there, because it could be wrong. Hopefully that makes sense. So Merlin is also a field guide. The Explore Birds button here, you can look at photos, which are really nice of the birds. These are all pulled from the Macaulay Library, so the same thing where I got all of my photos for tonight. Here's the Vesper sparrow example again. You can have, a little bit of details about the bird, and then they have a wider variety of sounds than something like the Sibley app does because they're drawing from that citizen science database. People upload their sound recordings to eBird, and then they pull the best recordings to include in this app. So the Cornell lab is extraordinary, and they've provided us with some extraordinary tools. They also have range maps, so, breeding, migration, winter range, and then a small part of the year-round range there. So that's Merlin. Your smartphone can also be used as a data entry portal. So this is really exciting. And this is how I like to use my phone. Well, I like to use my phone in all ways, but this is the best way. You can use Nature Mapping Jackson Hole. So we have a brand new app that we've just released this year. The best thing about Nature Mapping Jackson Hole is that it is a citizen science data entry portal. And we send all of the data that we collect to local land managers in the area. So they are directly receiving this information from us about what is present on the landscape. So that's a really, really impactful thing that you can do. You can put your sightings in nature mapping and help the land and wildlife managers make better decisions based on what is present in the landscape. There's also things called eBird and iNaturalist, screenshots here. I like to use them both too, but they're more, global tools that can be used versus nature mapping is very local. So a little bit about where to look for birds. So the great thing about birds is they are everywhere. So right in your own backyard is a great place to get started. It's a great way to also, with 900 species of birds in North America, that can feel a little bit overwhelming, but there's only a few species that are going to be present in your yard. So learning that community and learning the species that are present in that yard can be a great way to get started. Then when you go out into the broader world, you'll be able to recognize those things that you had in your backyard, and then also recognize when something is new. So that's a great way to get started. Once you get tired of all the birds in your backyard, you can start going further to, wildlife management areas and other state lands. National wildlife refuges are great, and other federal lands, the forests, the parks, things like that. So there's a lot of great places to look for birds, especially in this area. And then we can also use ebird.org to find birds near us. So when people use eBird, then all of this data feeds into the citizen science database where you can query the database. So here I've looked for red crossbill. Here's a nice photo of the crossbill. But then you can kind of see where red crossbills have been seen, and you can see they've been seen all over the place. So if you really wanted to see a red crossbill, you could go over here to the Felt Power Plant where I saw one last week, and you try to find the one that I found. So it's a really excellent tool in terms of finding birds that are around you. Some other local resources and broader resources, the Jackson Hole Bird and Nature Club is a really great place to get started. They have monthly meetings on a bird or nature related topic. They just gave a really great one about the avian influenza. Not sure what they have on board for April. It might be me, spoiler alert. But they have a monthly meeting that's worth going to. So I would go to their website and sign up for their newsletter, and then you'll get notifications about what's coming up for our programs. Cornell Lab of Ornithology, I've mentioned several times. They have a really great online resource called All About Birds. It's basically an online field guide with photos and information about birds. They organize the Great Backyard Bird Count. They organize Nest Watch, the Macaulay Library that we've mentioned. So Cornell is just a really great resource for birding. Audubon societies can be a really good resource as well. There's one in Idaho Falls. There are several in the state of Wyoming. They typically organize Christmas bird counts and are another really great resource. Facebook groups, similar to Merlin, to be used with caution, I would say, but there are a lot of Facebook groups that can provide a lot of really good information to you about birds. And so like, what's this bird is a great example of a Facebook group where people put up photos and ask, what bird is this? And then group members can comment on what they think the bird is. Now, remember, we don't know who's making that comment, so they could know what they're talking about or not. So to be used with caution. Someone is talking. So Facebook groups to be used with caution. There's a good one around this area called Teton Area Birding Society that I like. But there are several others, Wyoming Bird, Idaho Bird Sightings and Discussion, and Idaho Birding are all ones that I like for the local area. And then never discount your family and friends. Some of the most important information I've gained have been through conversations with my friends when we've been discussing a difficult bird ID, and we're going back and forth about what is it, and we're both realizing things that we didn't know before and sharing information amongst ourselves. So family and friends can be really good resources too. All right, launching right into some bird identification here. So the visual aspects of bird identification are things that people really key in on. Birds are beautiful. We like to see them. They often are visually appealing. And in this case of the Western tanager, we can see that it's visually distinctive. You know, we're not going to need a lot here. We see the red head, the yellow body, and the black back and wings. That's a Western tanager. There's not much more to it than that. So visually, it's very obvious. Something like the McGillivray's warbler is also pretty visually obvious, but we're not going to see them a lot. You know, they're a skulky bird that likes to remain in low and hidden in vegetation. They really are not frequently seen, but frequently what they will do is sing. Whoops, I don't know why that. So that was the sound of the McGillivray's warbler. So if we know that sound, we're going to be able to key in on where that bird is singing, and we're going to be able to maybe pinpoint its location well enough to eventually see it. Even if we don't see it, at least we're aware that it's there and we know about its presence, so we can put it into nature mapping or add it to our eBird checklist. But the auditory aspects of bird identification can greatly enhance your birding. You know, you're definitely not going to see every bird that is around you when you're out birding, but once you start learning the auditory signals, you're going to be able to get a lot more. And then what I like to call the holistic approach. So say we're out in Western Wyoming, the gorgeous sagebrush sea out there, you know, it's sunrise, suddenly this gray brownish bird pops up and starts singing. And this is like one of my favorite sounds. So that is the wonderful brewer's sparrow. And based on this kind of like holistic approach of like thinking about where we are, what habitat are we in, what geographic part of the country are we in, what is the bird doing, how does it sound, what does it look like, the kind of whole picture is what we're looking at here to identify birds. So let's kind of step through each of these aspects: visual bird identification. Where do we even start? So you look at your guide, there's 900 species of birds in North America. That can seem pretty overwhelming, and it's like a chicken and egg question. Do I sit there staring at my guide every night till I memorize everything and then go try to see? Do I go into the field not knowing what I'm looking at and, you know, then get frustrated and come back to the guide? It's going to end up being a combination of the two things. You know, you do want to probably start looking at your guide and seeing what's out there. It can be helpful if you have a guide that narrows it down, like the Western Guide to Sibley, Sibley Guide to Birds. But you are going to have to go into the field eventually, and you're going to be frustrated. You're not going to be able to get everything. So it's going to be a combination of the two things. But if you spend some time looking at your field guide and then also out in the field, that can be a pretty good approach, I would say. But knowing what you're talking about when you ask other people about birds can be extremely helpful. So a bird like this, you know, is fairly unremarkable, except it has this like really obvious pattern on its head where it's like these black and white stripes. That is what draws my eye immediately. You know, I'm not keying in on like the drabness over all of the rest of the bird, but it has these really like well-defined stripes on its crown. So if we can kind of think about what we're talking about and know how to describe birds to other people when we have questions, that can be really helpful, especially to someone like me who's getting questions all the time about bird ID. And it's like, Hilary, I saw, you know, this, and then they give a description of the bird and I like have no idea what they're talking about because I just, you know, they just need to know how to describe that bird a little bit better for it to be for the description to be helpful to me. So we're going to go right through some of the key characteristics of a bird here. Now, you're not going to memorize this all in one time, but what I think it is it's going to be helpful for you to know through the rest of the presentation, and maybe you'll remember a few of them, and then going forward, you can find images like this in the front of your field guides. So this is a typical songbird. Starting at the top here, the top part of the head is called the crown there. This eyebrow feature right here is called a supercilium. So that's probably sounds like a big jargony word, but that's the word used to describe this field marking on a bird. So that eyebrow is called the supercilium. This thing right here is called an eye line. So it's a line that kind of comes out of the end of the eye. And sometimes a bird's eye line will extend through the eye into the lore, is what this part of the bird is called. So that can be a really critical, diagnostic feature for separating something like a chipping sparrow and a brewer's sparrow in non-breeding plumage. So paying attention to that lore right there can be really important. This feather group right here covers the bird's ear. That is called the auricular. This mustache right here, that's called the malar. Right down below the bill called the throat. That's a fairly intuitive one. Getting into some easier stuff here. The front of the bird is called the breast right there. These are the sides going into the flanks right here and the belly. Some of these are similar to how we would describe ourselves. This is the vent, so that's where the bird excretes its waste. And then this feather group right here underneath that tail is called the undertail covert. So covert is a word that describes a group of feathers that covers the base of another group of feathers. So this tail right here, the undertail coverts are covering the base of that tail, similar to the upper tail coverts. This group that covers the bird's rump is called the upper tail covert. Getting into the wing here, now it gets really into the minutia of the details of the bird, but these are really important feather groups and they can be really helpful looking at these are called the greater coverts right here. They cover the secondary feathers, which are this feather group right here. So these greater coverts are often pale tipped in some birds, and that thing is called a wing bar right there. So it can be really helpful to notice if a bird has a wing bar or not. Here in the, let's see, those are the median coverts. This can also have a wing bar there. So paying attention to these can be really important. These are the scapulars. They kind of cover the shoulder of the bird. That's the mantle. The back is called the mantle there. And then the back of the head, similar to us, is called the nape. So there you have it. Those are the kind of the parts of the bird that are really critical to be looking at. And again, you're not going to pay attention and know everything now, but going forward, these are kind of some of the things you're going to want to be looking at. So back to our white-crowned sparrow example, of course, the crown is white. It actually has a white median stripe, and then the rest of the crown is that black color, has a white supercilium, black eyeline. This guy has a dark lore right there. The nape is gray, the breast and sides are gray. The flanks are actually kind of that brownish color, and then the belly is white. The tail and wings kind of have some of this darker gray coloration. But then look at this. This guy has wing bars. Remember how that marking was called a wing bar right there? Those tips of the greater coverts right there. That can be a really good field marking to notice. And then its mantle is this striped pattern. So it's brown and white stripes. So these kind of images present in the beginning part of any field guide. So you can refer back to that front of your field guide if you ever have questions about what part of the bird you saw. This goes into a little bit more detail on the feather groups of the wing. The primaries and secondaries are really important, flight feather groups, and then all these coverts that cover the bases of those feathers. So here's just a few examples about where we're going to talk about where's the red on these birds. And then also just describing some of the other field markings using the words that we just learned. So now on this guy, the cap or the crown is that reddish color. And then it has going to have a white throat, a white malar, remember that word. And then the coverts and the flight feathers of this bird are super beautiful. These like green edged feathers are just amazingly wonderful. The green-tailed towhee is one of my favorite birds. His belly looks like it's white there, and then he's pretty gray overall on the sides and even into his nape there. So this is a broad-tailed hummingbird. Hummingbirds often have iridescent gorgets on their throat is the technical word for that part of a hummingbird, but it can also just be called the throat. And then we're going to want to examine, other things, like it has these green sides, in another species of hummingbird, that part might be buffy. These guys are really cool. They have a really diagnostic wing trill, the males do, as they fly through the cottonwood galleries around Jackson. So listen up for that sound. Here's a downy woodpecker. So it's going to have definitely a black crown. Then it has this white supercilium, a black eye line, getting into some of the these different parts here. It's going to have, that black malar, the white throat, white belly. A really great thing to look for on downy and hairy woodpeckers, which can be two confusing birds, are these white outer tail feathers here. So you can see on this downy woodpecker, there's all these black spots on those outer tail feathers. On the hairy woodpecker, those are just going to be white without any of those black spots. Here's the gray catbird, another skulker that we don't see a lot, but when we do see it, we see that the red is in this under tail covert feather group. Remember those guys? They cover the base of the tail feathers. So that can be a really great thing to look for on the gray catbird. It also has a black crown, and then overall it's pretty gray otherwise. This is the Cassin's finch. This is another one of my favorite birds around Jackson. Been seeing a lot of them at my bird feeders recently. These guys have this really gorgeous raspberry crown, and then you can see it has kind of a pinkish supercilium. The auricular has that darker marking, the malar, a little bit of brown in there. And then the main difference between these guys and something like a house finch is they have these really thin, crisp streaks on their flanks. But other than that, they don't have any streaking. And you'll see the house finches at your feeder have a lot of like thick brown streaks in this area. So pay attention to the sides and flanks of the finches you're looking at your feeders. This guy is always a fun one. People will call me up and say, Hilary, I saw a black bird with a red wing. What would that be? Well, that would be the red-winged blackbird, the common name that does not lie. But we can look at this bird and we can see, most of the greater coverts here are black, the primary coverts are black. But then getting into the median coverts and the scapulars, we see that there's some red and yellow in those feather groups. So that can be a really fun one. They're showing up en masse in the Teton Valley right now. So looking at your field guide, you're going to notice that birds are not ordered by their size or their color or the alphabet or anything like that. They're going to be ordered in what is known as taxonomic order. So that is the order that is used because it tells us how organisms are related to each other. So birds that are closely related to each other are going to be lumped more closely together in the field guide. You might think to yourself, why is there a peregrine falcon and a red-crowned parrot on the screen together right now? Well, this is one of my favorite examples because parrots and falcons are actually more closely related to each other than falcons are to other birds of prey. And when we look at these birds, we can kind of start to see some of those similarities. The bill shape is similar, the flesh around the eye, the elongated body shape. But yeah, here is this is a simplified diagram of kind of the relationships of where falcons diverged and then became, so this group of birds diverged here and became falcons. The rest of them radiated into the parrots. And way over here, we have the hawks and eagles and osprey and all of the other birds of prey that we're kind of thinking of, as we always think of, falcons as being like very similar to these other birds of prey, but actually genetically and evolutionarily, they're more close to the parrots. So that's a fun fact. Common names, incidentally, can be kind of confusing sometimes because the common name might not tell us how closely related two things are to each other. So both of these things are called a grosbeak. This is the evening grosbeak. It's a finch that we might see at our bird feeders in the winter. I've been seeing a lot of them at my house recently. And this is a black-headed grosbeak, which is actually more closely related to the cardinals, that kind of the red crested guy that you might see on the East Coast, than it is to the finches. So even though they have the same name, they're both called a grosbeak in their common name, that common name is a little bit misleading because they're not actually that closely related to each other. Same thing here with sparrows. So the house sparrow is an invasive species in North America, and it's actually one of the true sparrows from the old world. This song sparrow is a native species, and it is a New World sparrow. Even though they both have the name sparrow in their common name, they're not anything close to each other. They're not both sparrows. They are different taxonomic groups entirely. You'll see, flocks of house sparrows under your feeder or pecking around at the crumbs, while you're eating outside of Persephone in the summer or something. Typically, you'll only see song sparrows singly or individually along creeks and riparian areas. You'll hear them singing and stuff like that. So you're never going to see a group of 30 song sparrows underneath your feeder. I'm sorry to say, those are probably house sparrows. So we'll talk about the aspects here of visual bird identification: size, shape, behavior, and then everybody's favorite, the plumage details. But if we can get at these three things before we start digging into the plumage details, often we can have a pretty good idea of what we're talking about. So size is the first thing. My disclaimer with size is that in the field, size is incredibly difficult to judge. So people say, I saw it, it was huge. And I'm like, well, huge relative to what, or compared to what? Like, what is huge? Was it far away? Was it close? It can be hard to tell. So it is difficult to judge. Another thing is that young birds, contrary to mammals, we see a small mammal, and that is, likely if we see a cervid, a deer that's small, that's going to be, frequently a baby deer. That's not necessarily true with birds. Often when birds fledge from the nest, they are the same size, or even sometimes their mass can be larger than the adult bird. So this is a great example. The northern pygmy owl only reaches a size of about 6 inches. It's one of the smaller owls in Wyoming. But this is a full adult bird of that size. So it's just a small species. It's not a baby owl, which is what a lot of people think. So here are the primary wing feathers. Another great resource is the Feather Atlas that's run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can see these are both adult birds, but the primary wing feathers of the northern pygmy owl don't even reach 8 centimeters. That's a tiny bird compared to the great horned owl adult, where these primary wing feathers are almost 4 times larger. So, and these are both adult birds. So just, kind of start thinking about, there are small species and there are large species, but juveniles and adults of both are approximately the similar size. So precocial birds are birds that hatch out of the egg and that are immediately mobile. So these are things like ducks, swans, gallinaceous birds like pheasants, grouse, things like that. These little babies are immediately mobile, and they are going to be smaller than the adults, but typically they're like these little fuzzy fuzz balls, and they're like with an adult, and it can be pretty easy to tell that, yes, that's a baby bird. That's obviously with an adult. So they can be, usually they're pretty easy to tell that they're babies. They're usually really fuzzy because they don't have like these fully developed feathers yet. This is an example of 2 orange-crowned warblers that are about to fledge from their nest. These birds, typically when passerines fledge from the nest, they have super short tails because those feathers haven't completely grown in yet. Same thing here with the primary wing feathers. Those feathers just haven't completed growing out of their sheaths yet. So their feathers and their wing feathers and tail feathers are typically shorter than the adults, but their general body size is approximately equivalent, or like I said, they can even be heavier in mass because they've just been sitting in a nest being fed by their parents. So when they fledge out of that nest, they will be approximately the same size. You can also tell a baby bird because it usually has this like frowny yellow gape. That's how the parents can find the mouth to feed the babies. And then they have this like messy feather hairdo that's super cute. So you can tell a baby bird, but just not by its size. Often relative size can be helpful. So these 2 species are the greater and the lesser yellow legs. Their plumage characteristics are almost identical. And the main difference here between these 2 species is actually their size. So if we just saw one or the other, it might be difficult. You know, we might be looking and seeing like, I'm not sure if that's a greater or lesser, it's big or little compared to what. It's just by itself, we don't know. But if it's with another of the different species, or even if there was, say, a killdeer next to the lesser yellowlegs, we could see, oh, those two birds are approximately the same size. It's probably a lesser yellowlegs. Or, oh, the yellowlegs is much larger than the killdeer. It's probably a greater yellowlegs. And that can even be helpful with like raptors sitting on a power pole. You know, a golden eagle sitting on a power pole is going to be approximately the same, you know, basic size as that power pole, versus a prairie falcon sitting on a power pole is going to appear much smaller. So size relative to nearby objects can be helpful. Shape is also really helpful. So without seeing any plumage details, size, anything here, we can gain a lot of information. You know, we know that this guy is probably going to be a bird of prey. This is some kind of waterfowl. And then, you know, the flamingos are fairly obvious. We can tell that this is a flamingo without any further information. Knowing your silhouettes with raptors can be super helpful. So falcons, and this information also tells a lot about the ecology of the animal. So what is it doing in its local environment? Falcons are built for speed. They have these like sickle-shaped wings and that long tail, so they can dive bomb in on their prey. And speed is how they kill their prey. Now, the accipiters, or the forest hawks, have these short but broad wings and a long tail that acts like a rudder for maneuvering through the forest as they go pursuing their prey. They have to navigate around a lot of obstacles, so that body shape helps them to navigate that environment. So these are things like sharp-shinned Cooper's hawks and northern goshawks. The buteos are the open land, like our red tails, our rough legs, our Swainsons that come in the summer. These guys have broad, long wings and a short, broad tail because they take advantage of thermal lift. Often you can see them circle soaring above an open landscape. So if you just get a kind of a silhouette of a raptor, you can often narrow it down to one of these groups. Some birds have just a super distinctive shape. A bird with a bill this long is not going to be anything other than the long-billed curlew, you know, that bulky shorebird with the longest bill relative to its body size of any North American bird. That's going to be a pretty obvious one. Even if it was just a silhouette, we can confidently identify that bird. Another really obvious silhouette is the belted kingfisher. So if they have this large head, a huge bill, a big shaggy crest, even if we couldn't see any color on this, if we saw this shape sitting on a wire or a branch over water, we're going to be able to know that that's definitely a belted kingfisher. Some birds have superficial similarities in their shapes. So these two birds are very similar shaped. You know, they both have long necks, long legs, a body that's kind of long and bulky. But once we get into the details, you know, the great blue heron is going to have these plumes coming off the back of its head. It also has these plumes on its breast. The sandhill crane has these beautiful kind of plumes coming off the back end there. And one main difference between these is people frequently will see great blue herons perched up. So you can see this guy's like standing on a log. It has that longer back toe that allows it to perch on things. You can see in this sandhill crane has a very short back toe. So they aren't typically able to actually perch on things. They're typically seen walking through fields or standing in shallow water or something like that. So that can be a difference that can help you, is like kind of where is the bird standing. If it's perched up, it's probably going to be a great blue heron. These two birds, this is an identification conundrum for a lot of people. Is it a raven or a crow? So shape can be helpful with the raven and the crow. The raven has this huge bill. So check the size of that bill compared to the small kind of dinky bill of the American crow. Relative to its head size, the bill of the raven is huge. The eye looks really small and it's kind of pushed forward on the head. The head looks really small compared to the more, you know, reasonably proportionate crow, where it's like, okay, this, you know, head size is more proportional to the bill versus this huge bill of the raven. But really, ravens and crows can be much easier to identify once they're in flight. So we see here that the tail shape is where there's a difference. The crow has this much more rounded fan-shaped tail because each of these tail feathers is approximately the same length as the other. On the raven, we see that there's this diamond-shaped kind of thing on the tail. So that's because these outer tail feathers are shorter and then they get longer toward the middle. So it kind of creates this diamond shaped. So once a bird is in flight, they're pretty easy to identify. Here they are together. The crow is much smaller. The raven is much larger. But even in this kind of bad picture, we can see that wedge shape to the raven's tail. And honestly, you know, they're tough. Sometimes I'll be out birding and I see a black, you know, corvid flying in the distance, and I just have to say, I don't know what that is. I can't tell. I can't see the tail well enough. I can't get anything on size. Like, it's just you know, I know it's crow or raven, but I don't know which one. So behavior can also be really helpful. Something like the American Dipper, one of my favorite North American birds, is a guy that is a songbird, but they regularly swim in the water. So if you see a songbird sitting on a stone near a creek and it's like kind of dipping up and down doing this, and then it dives into the water and goes underneath, even if we couldn't see any color on that bird, we know that it's an American Dipper because it's doing that behavior and it's in the correct habitat. So that can be a really diagnostic behavior for that species. Sometimes behavior can be helpful in narrowing down a group of species. So in the example of diving versus dabbling ducks, here we have mallards on the left. They're a member of the dabbling group. So typically dabblers inhabit shallower water bodies where they can reach the bottom of the water body and kind of grab up vegetation or invertebrates off the bottom. They're not going to ever go completely underneath the water. They'll tip up and you'll just see their tails and their wings like this. That's definitely going to be a dabbling duck. So once you've seen that behavior, you've eliminated a whole group. It's not going to be a diving duck. Similarly, mergansers and other diving ducks will go completely underneath the water when they're foraging. Golden eyes are another great example of these. Once you see a duck diving underneath the water, you've eliminated the dabbling ducks. They don't have any overlap. Another behavioral example is the turkey vulture and the golden eagle, two superficially similar species. You know, I've seen many times the turkey vulture or golden eagle and thought it was the other until I saw, you know, I got a better look or saw this behavioral thing that happens. So in the air, the golden eagle, when it goes into a soar, is a very stable bird. They kind of circle around and they're just very stable. But the turkey vulture, when it goes into a soar, it's like tipping and tilting, and it kind of almost looks like it's going to fall out of the sky, is what my mom always used to say. So once you see that behavior, that's never going to be a golden eagle. It's definitely going to be the turkey vulture that has that instability in the air. And finally, and everyone's favorite thing to look at, what color was it? That's the, you know, everyone wants to try to get at the color when they look at a bird. And this can be helpful once you've looked at all of these other things. So this is a hard one to identify, you know, like a lot of novice birders would look at this and they're like, I don't know, I'm not getting anything, you know. It's like, yeah, it has these black tips on the feathers. It's real marbled in here. It's got like some banding on the tail. It's like got a dark head, you know. What is this? I don't know. As a novice birder. But when I look at a raptor that's soaring over me, the first thing I do is I always key in on that leading edge of the wing. And you can see that there's a darkness there in that leading edge. That's called a patagial marking. And it's a characteristic key for the red-tailed hawk. Whoops, sorry about that. So this is an adult. This was a trick question. This is a juvenile red-tailed hawk on this side, which are a bit trickier to identify than the classic adult with that red tail, you know, the dark head, the belly band. This is a way more classic example of this bird. But even when it's a tough juvenile like this guy, we have that dark patagial. That's a key characteristic that we can key in on. And you can see the adult has it here too. So if a bird of prey has that dark leading edge between the elbow and the head there, that's going to be a red-tailed hawk. Another plumage difference here, this is a bird that we're all familiar with, the chickadees, one of my favorite groups of birds. Obvious difference here with this white supercilium. You know, we can all see, okay, that's a mountain chickadee, it has the white supercilium. But say the head of the bird was covered, it was like in a conifer and we can't see it very well. We can look and we can see other differences between these two species. So the white edging on the flight feathers that's present on the black-capped chickadee is not present on the mountain chickadee. It's a much drabber, more gray-toned bird. These are much brighter, more contrasty. Even in the face, you can see that brightness and difference in color there. The black-capped chickadee also has a much buffier flank there, so that kind of almost pinkish wash on the flank is not present on the mountain chickadee. Another identification conundrum that a lot of people struggle with are the swallows. So swallows are very dynamic flyers. You know, they're moving around quickly. They're flying out over this body of water. There's hundreds of them. You know, what am I looking at here? But when I look at a group of swallows out over water, I always key in on the extent of the white, especially to distinguish between these two species. So we see on the violet green swallow, oh, they're so gorgeous. They're one of my favorites. But they have this white that extends up above the eye there, and then the eye is kind of isolated in that white. So that can be a really great thing to look for, but even better, you might not always be able to see the head great, but you can always get a look at that rump, and you can see that the white extends quite far up onto the rump, leaving only a thin strip of color there. So you can look at that bird, you know, you're looking out at a group of swallows, you see them. I key in immediately on the rumps of the birds. That's what I'm trying to get at, so I can see, are these violet greens or trees? Now, that's not to say the tree swallow doesn't have any white. It has limited white, but it does not extend far up onto the rump, and there's a broad patch of color there. Similarly with the eye, the blue color is only below the eye there. So that can be a definite plumage characteristic that you really want to key in on when you're looking at swallows over water. Moving right along into the auditory aspects of bird identification. So this is me on the right. I don't always listen for birds when I'm around non-birders. Just kidding. Yes, I do. So if you're trying to have a conversation with me and it's like summer in Jackson and we're standing outside, I'm probably not listening to you. I'm probably trying to assess the avian community that's around us right now because I just can't stop myself. Once you start learning auditory bird identification, songs, calls, and non-vocal sounds, you will never be able to turn it off because there's always a bird making a sound somewhere and you're just always going to be getting distracted by those birds. So welcome to the challenge of having a conversation outside in the summer. But getting started with sounds can be hard. You know, it's like we've all been outside hearing all these birds sing. It's like, oh, what am I listening to? There's 20 different sounds coming at me at once. You know, where do I even start with that? So Merlin can be really helpful, as I said, to be used with caution, but also studying does help. You know, you could sit down at the Macaulay Library. You can kind of listen to all these sounds. Maybe you want to sit down and investigate the variation in ruby-crowned kinglet sounds, for instance. That can help you. You know, you can start to memorize sounds that way. But honestly, there's no substitute for just being in the field, going through kind of the slog of like not knowing what you're hearing and then figuring it out, and figuring it out is going to be so rewarding. And like I said earlier, it can be helpful to start with a small subset. So start with the birds that are in your yard. You know, you can start identifying the chickadees, the house finches, the house sparrows, the magpies. All of those species have a different sound, and once you learn those, now when you hear something else, you know it's not one of those, and you can kind of start investigating like, okay, well, what is that? When you're out in the field and you hear a bird you don't know, find the bird, find that bird that's making that sound. And then once you see, oh, it's a ruby-crowned kinglet, don't just, you know, leave and go on to the next thing. Focus on that bird and watch it as it's singing, because having that visual and auditory connection between those two things can help you remember that. Even after you've made that identification, kind of continuing to focus can help. And then I always like to view the spectrograms to help me visualize that sound. So here's the spectrogram of the ruby-crowned kinglet. Starts off with this series of high-pitched notes or high-frequency notes going into this lower frequency sound and then some warbling at the end. So here is the song. So visualizing that can help. It really helps me. That's one of the best ways for me to learn sounds that I don't know. The differences between songs, calls, and non-vocal sounds. So songs are often complex. They're longer typically. They're more melodic typically than the calls. But of course, there are exceptions that we'll go over. And typically they are used to defend territories or attract a mate. That's kind of like what you'll be experiencing when you hear a sound. So this is one of my favorite summer singers, the sage thrasher. And you can see the spectrogram here. It just goes on and on. They're ramble. They incorporate the sounds of other species into their own songs. And they can just be a really wonderful thing to spend time with in the summer out in the sagebrush. They can sing for like 5 minutes without taking, stopping or taking a break. So they can be really fun. And this is their song. They just go on and on. Their songs are so long, and that's a bad example probably, because most bird songs aren't that long. They sing shorter phrases, but they're still longer than the typical call would be. So here's an example of a group of birds that's extremely difficult to identify are the Empidonax flycatchers. We've all probably seen the drab gray bird and like, I don't know what that is. That's a flycatcher of some kind. But once the flycatcher opens its mouth and starts singing, that sound is diagnostic per species of flycatcher. So they're actually one of the birds that you're gonna want to know the sounds, because when you try to look at them and visually separate them, you don't really want to try to do that. I mean, it is possible, but it's very difficult. So this is a willow flycatcher. It says Fitzbew is the mnemonic device for this song. It goes Fitzbew, Fitzbew, and it's just a very short song, and that's its song. That's not a call. So the interesting thing about flycatchers is that their songs are known innately. They know their song from hatching out of that egg. They don't have to hear a parent sing it, versus something like the sage thrasher and many other passerines. They learn their songs actually from adults and from other individuals. So flycatchers know their songs innately, which could be why they're shorter. And experimentally, it's been shown that, they can be raised in complete isolation, yet they will still sing the correct song. So that's one of my favorite things about flycatchers. Calls are simple, shorter, often not melodic, and they're used to communicate between individuals and between organisms, even of different species. They can be used to stay in touch, which is the example of like nocturnal flight calls. A lot of passerines actually migrate at night. So birds are flying over our heads, migrating as we're sleeping. And they use these nocturnal flight calls to stay in touch with flock members as they're migrating through the night sky. But an example of this would be, so I recorded this yellow warbler, and it was chipping at me. It was communicating with me because it had a nest in the area and it wanted me to focus on it, and it didn't want me to find its nest. So it was communicating with me, trying to draw its attention over towards me. So it's just that simple kind of chipping sound, but birds can get really agitated and they'll really chip at you a lot if there's a nest in the area or a fledgling in the area. So that's the bird communicating with you because it thinks that you're a predator. So this is the type of a sound you can tell it's a much higher frequency. It's up there at like 10. This one, is a lower frequency sound. The bird wants to be detected. When a bird is making this sound, it does not want to be detected. It has noticed that there's extreme danger in the area, and it's trying to alert its family members and even other members of different species in that community that there is extreme danger. So this would be an example of a sound a bird would make as like an accipiter's flying overhead, or there's like some level of danger where the bird could potentially die and it knows it, and it does not want to be seen by that aerial predator, but it wants to notify other birds that there's danger. So it's a much higher pitched sound because higher pitched sounds are harder to localize. And then this is a nocturnal flight call. Unfortunately, I don't have a recording, but you can see that it's a lower frequency. And these are the signals that birds use to stay in touch with each other as they're migrating. Even when they're not flying, they make these calls not only when they're flying at night, but when they're flying during the day. So just a few non-vocal sounds here. Non-vocal sounds can be used in courtship displays to signal danger. When they're foraging, they often make sounds. And they're often a lower frequency. So you can see here, this is the greater sage grouse's sound. You could barely even see that there's a sound on this spectrogram because the sound is so low frequency and it comes from those air sacs that it fills up. So this is the sound. So that is those air sacs that it's filling up, and then those are creating that non-vocal sound. This is the example of a mourning dove's wing flutter as it flies up away from a branch. So this could be, maybe it's used as a signal for danger. When something flushes the dove, makes that sound as it's flying away, then other species might know, like, oh, why did that dove flush? Like maybe might want to look around. So that's another non-vocal sound that's made by the feathers moving in the air. A woodpecker. So woodpeckers peck at trees, as you might know. So when they do that, they make a sound, and you're not going to be able to identify the woodpecker based on its tapping sound, but it'll alert you to the presence of a woodpecker in the area so that you then might be able to go ahead and find that bird and see what species it is. So this is the foraging tapping of the hairy woodpecker. So whenever I hear that sound, I start looking around and I'm trying to find the bird because I want to identify it. But it can be a good signal that there is a bird in the area. And then one of my all-time favorite birds, the common nighthawk, has a fabulous display where they dive through the air and they create this sound that's called their booming display. So in this recording, you'll hear a vocalization, which is this kind of like higher frequency sound. And then the lower frequency, this is the boom that you'll hear in this recording. So it's vocalizing at the same time that it's kind of doing this like booming display that is a vibration between the feathers as it's flying down. So just briefly about sound quality here. So sounds can be described in a variety of ways, and it can be helpful to know kind of what you're listening for. So this is the brewer's sparrow. The song you heard earlier, that's my favorite thing ever, was its long song. This is its short song that incorporates a lot of buzzing. So that buzzing sound of the brewer's sparrow is diagnostic, and it's these kind of lower frequency notes that are really closely linked together. A higher frequency sound that has a similar appearance on the spectrogram is a trill. So this is the cedar waxwing. So you can hear that kind of trilling sound, but it's much higher. One of my favorite summer singers in the Tetons is called the fox sparrow, and you can see that this spectrogram incorporates these kind of really long, clear notes. Those are what I refer to as whistles. And then this fox sparrow's song, as you'll hear, also incorporates trilling and buzzing. So this is the fox sparrow. They just have the sweetest whistle. I love that sound. And each phrase of the song is invariably different. This is what I call a nasal sound. So this is a sound you'll hear kind of ubiquitously throughout the, the national forests around here. This is the red-breasted nuthatch. So it's that kind of nasal, like kind of toy horn tooting kind of a sound. Now, this is a bird that will inhabit juniper patches in the wintertime, chasing any other bird it sees away from the juniper patch. So you'll have like 200 Bohemian waxwings come in on a juniper, and a single Townsend solitaire will drive them out. But they also have this really distinct sound where it's just kind of one like simple note that they have. And I think, to me, this has a quality of a kind of a thin sound. Now we'll hear, look at this. When we look at this, it might look similar to that Townsend solitaire. It's the single tooting sound of the northern pygmy owl, but to me, this has a much richer sound quality. So kind of thinking about some ways to describe sounds when you're saying like, oh, I heard a buzzing sound, or I heard a whistled song, when you're describing something to someone. So we're getting down to the final stretch here. I appreciate you guys having stayed on with me this long. Just a couple of examples of the holistic approach, and then we'll wrap up. But the holistic approach includes thinking about, where are you? So what geographic area? We're in maybe Western Wyoming or Eastern Idaho here. What's the habitat like? The behavioral, what is that bird doing? What is its shape and size? What sounds are it making? And finally, what plumage details? If you're able to think about all of these things, you can probably arrive at what the bird probably is by yourself. And then if you can't, you can go to your Merlin app or your friend. But if you're going to a friend, it can be helpful to describe the variety of things. If someone came to me and said, I was in Western Wyoming, I was out in the sagebrush, I saw this small brown bird pop up onto the top of the sage and start singing this buzzy song. Immediately, I know that that's a brewer's sparrow, that there's just nothing else it's going to be. So if you can kind of describe some of those things to your friend in the way that we've done throughout this class, that can be really helpful to people when you're talking about birds. So here's an example. So we're out in the wonderful riparian area here. There's the Tetons in the background. It's the winter time. We see here's the species range map. It's present in the area year round. So we know that we're in the right place and time. We're in this riparian habitat. Maybe there's a creek, here's some conifer, but there's a lot of willow in this area. And suddenly this bird pops up. Oh my gosh, what is that bird? And often, birds, we're all sitting here looking at this bird and we can see it fairly well, or hopefully you can. But often they don't stay up like this. They'll pop up and then they'll go back down. We got like a second long look at it, but we know we're in the willows, we're in this riparian area. And then suddenly it starts calling. The sound is very diagnostic for this species. So if we knew that sound, immediately we're like, oh, okay, that's a whatever. We know what the species is, but maybe we don't know what that call note was, but then suddenly the bird starts singing. Singing its lovely song there. And then it pops up and we get a way better look and we're like, oh my gosh, based on all these things we knew, it was in the riparian area, in the willows, it was chimping, that was that call note we heard, and then it started singing. Now we're getting a great look at it. It has this, the streaks converge to a central spot right here. It has this really rufous, rusty tones, the rusty eyeline, rusty stripes in the head. Thin but kind of blurry streaking on the sides. That is going to be none other than the song sparrow. So we arrived at that, even if we didn't get a really great look at the bird right off based on the habitat, the geography, the time of year that we were there, the sounds that it was making, and then finally looking in at those plumage characteristics. So that's kind of the holistic approach. One more example here is Jackson Lake. Here we are at the dam. There's the wonderful Tetons there. We're looking out, and suddenly we hear this sound. Oh my gosh. Some of us might already know right away based on that sound. We've heard that sound before, the bird's agitated by our presence, but maybe we don't know what that sound is. And we're looking, we're kind of, looking in the direction of the sound. And then, oh my gosh, there it is. It's on the beach down there. And it's this like really weird looking small bird with two thick stripes on its neck, but it's far away. We're not really getting that great of a look. Maybe we want to like approach it cautiously so we can get a little bit closer to the bird. Maybe some of us know now based on this photo what the bird is, but those of us in the group that don't, we're getting a little bit closer, and then we see it and it kind of starts to act like it's hurt. It's like doing this like kind of broken wing thing where it looks like we might need to take it to a rehabilitation center or something because the bird might be. So we moved toward it a little bit more, thinking we might be able to grab it, and suddenly it flies away, and it was fine because it was a killdeer and it was doing its broken wing display for us because it had a chick in the area and it was trying to distract us from going toward its chick. So the first distraction signal was that sound it was making. The second distraction signal was that display that it made for us. So kind of just thinking about the holistic approach, it involves the habitat that we're in, the geographic area that we're in, the sounds the birds are making, the behavior that they're displaying. The broken wing display is what the killdeer is famous for in this example. So all of those things together lead us to an easy identification. And, myself thinking about when I go birding, I make these, I move through steps 1 through 5 of the holistic approach in like half a second. It's like just automatic for me. It's like, you don't even really have to think about it once you've practiced it and gained a lot of knowledge about birds. So we're finally to the end. I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing me talk, probably. But I did want to give you a couple of parting thoughts before we separate. I will say that birding is a lifelong journey. It's a lifelong learning experience. It enriches my life every single day because every single day I learned something new that I didn't know before about birds. I learned things that I didn't know when I was putting together this presentation. Every time I go birding, I see something new that I didn't see before. Even if it's like the most common species I've ever seen, I'll see it doing something interesting and I'll learn something new. So it's a lifelong learning experience. It is really hard, so be gentle with yourselves. Back to our example of the Impidinax flycatchers, the impossible group. They all look the same and they sound different. So if you learn those sounds, that'll help you. But just be gentle with yourself. Eventually, you will get there. You will be able to identify the Impidinax flycatchers, but it'll take time and it's a long learning process. Never feel ashamed of asking questions or misidentifying birds. This is part of the process. And I've often found with myself that when I've made a misidentification, that's actually the best opportunity I have to learn something. And often when I've made those misidentifications and I'm like feeling kind of embarrassed about it, I will remember what I've learned in those situations more. So please don't feel ashamed of asking questions or misidentifying birds. It happens to everyone. I always say if I didn't misidentify a bird that day, I didn't look at enough birds that day because they're hard and it's tough. I love this meme that's like the novice birder. How do I identify the Impidinax flycatchers? And then me, the supposed expert, saying, that's the neat part. You don't, because I still struggle with it sometimes and it's just really hard. So be gentle with yourselves, and also understanding of the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is the paper that was published showing a difference between perceived ability and then actual ability. I thought this was really funny when I was putting together the presentation. This is the chart everyone always shows to demonstrate this concept, but this is not the chart that was in the peer-reviewed literature. This is the chart that was in peer-reviewed literature, but it does demonstrate a concept, right? You'll see the skill increasing slowly and the confidence really increasing strongly. You're learning a lot. You're like, oh my gosh, I know this and this, and I'm thinking that I know so much because I know more than I did before. But then you kind of reach a point where you're like, ooh, I don't know that much. I don't know I now know more, and I like think I may have made a lot of mistakes. So your confidence in that skill starts to drop, even though the skill itself is still increasing. And that's the same thing here. You can see the actual test score and their perceived ability eventually do meet. And then you get to a place like this is where I'm at, where you're like, ooh, there's so much I don't know, that even though I'm like, I know a lot and I'm pretty good, I'm like still down here because I'm like thinking, what don't I know, essentially. So be gentle with yourselves on the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's not to make you feel bad. It's just to remind you that, you know a lot more than you knew maybe before this presentation, but to kind of keep yourself in check sometimes. And then finally, the joy of birds. Birds have brought me so much joy in my life. I've loved them since a child. They've been with me through some of my darkest times, and they have just been the light in my life at those times. So look at them, listen to them, enjoy them for their intrinsic value. Just simply the fact of that organism existing at that time and place is extremely valuable. So please take that, and also take steps to protect the birds that you will come to love by keeping your cats inside. Cats kill billions of birds each year. They're the #1 cause of anthropogenic mortality on birds in North America. So keeping those cats inside can protect a lot of birds. Fix your windows. So this is a window fixture that I put up to keep birds from running into my windows. They're just simple strings that you hang across your windows. The problem with windows often is not that the bird wants to fly into your house or it thinks it can fly through this window and out that window. It perceives this habitat. So a sharp-shinned hawk is chasing it, and it sees that tree and it's trying to get into that tree as fast as it can to avoid the hawk, and it flies into the window. These kind of fixtures can break up that reflection. Simply sticking like a hawk sticker on your window is not going to do it. That's fairly ineffective in terms of, you need to do something that's going to break up the entire reflection. And you might think, well, I don't want to be looking at that. I don't want to look at that, when I look out my window. But when I look out my window and I see these, I remind myself that I have made a difference for birds. When I installed these on my house, I noticed within a day there was a reduction in window strikes. So it's not a negative thing when I'm looking out. And eventually I got to the point where I don't even notice them anymore. So I would encourage you to fix your windows. You can reach out to me if you have more questions about that. The third leading cause of anthropogenic bird mortality is vehicle collisions. So this is a great gray owl I found on a stretch of road up through Island Park. Driving less is going to have a lot of far-reaching implications. Consider taking the bus. I take the bus to work when I have to go to Jackson. But it also has implications for large mammal vehicle collisions, climate change, ride your bike when you want to go birding, or, walk to the park when you want to go birding. Driving less is a great way to make a great impact. Planting native vegetation. So planting native vegetation is a thing that we can all do. And actually, we don't need to feed birds black oil sunflower. We can just plant their native food sources in our yards, and that will attract actually a greater diversity of birds than just having a black oil sunflower seeder. Well, that's great for the finches and the house sparrows, but when you plant, say, choke cherries in your yard and other fruiting shrubs, you will end up attracting warblers, thrushes, tanagers, all this like huge diversity of birds that don't feed on seeds will end up in your yard. Insects are often thought of as the base of the food chain for a lot of these things, but their food is native vegetation. So when we plant native vegetation, we're also helping those insect populations that are having a really hard time right now. Practicing ethical photography. So this is a really horrible example of a person who has placed a mouse on their head, hoping to attract that great gray owl to come in so they can get the perfect shot. This is something that's just simply unacceptable. Hopefully no one in this group would even really think about doing this, but it's an example of a concept, right? We want to be ethical in our photography. A more common example is seeing the rough-legged hawk on the side of the road. It's perched up on a phone pole. We stop our car to take a picture of the bird. The bird flushes to the next pole. We chase it to the next pole to try to get that photo. Flushing the bird continually like that forces it to keep moving and expending energy that it really doesn't have in a really difficult time of the year for that bird, which is the winter. So not flushing raptors off poles to get photos of them is one thing that you can do that really helps. And finally, drinking bird-friendly coffee. So a lot of the birds that we have here in Jackson are what are known as neotropical migrants. So they spend the majority of that year in Central and South America. They're not really dependent on these habitats for the majority of the year. They're dependent on those tropical habitats. So drinking bird-friendly coffee, because coffee can be grown under the natural canopy of the shade forest, means that we're preserving bird habitat while producing coffee. You know, that means that the habitat is not being cut down to produce coffee because it is able to be grown under that native canopy. All of these things are great. You know, fair trade is great, organic is great, Rainforest Alliance is great. These are all good certifications to have, but the only certification that guarantees that you are drinking shade-grown bird-friendly coffee is that bird-friendly certification from the Smithsonian Institute. So whenever I'm looking to buy my coffee, I always make sure it has that bird-friendly certification, because even if it has all these other things, the forest could still be getting cut down to produce that coffee. Okay. That's my final soapbox. If you enjoyed this presentation, I will say that there is another presentation, not by me, it's by Teton Raptor Center, on raptor identification, and that will be next Wednesday at 6 p.m. So if you struggle with raptors and you want to participate in that, I would highly encourage you to participate in that. So thanks for joining me, and happy spring. Oh boy, it's 7:28. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. So if you guys if you have questions, someone asked, what about the Merlin app? We did talk about the Merlin app. So if you have further questions about the Merlin app, we can get together and you can talk. You can talk with me about the Merlin app. It is to be used with caution, I would say. That's what I'll say about the Merlin app. James asks, if you identify a bird with a band on it, are you supposed to report that at all? That is such a great question. And actually, we have a bluebird banding project in Jackson. So yes, if you see a bird with a band on it, you should report that. If the bands have a color combination, you can report that. You can report it to the bird banding laboratory, but if you see a bluebird that's color banded, you can also report it right to me. You can email me and say, hey, Hilary, I saw the bird with a red over silver and blue over yellow on its leg. And that's really great information. But if you find a dead bird, say it was a roadkill or something that has a band on its leg, and you can get that number off the aluminum band, you can report that right to the USGS and the bird banding laboratory at reportband.gov. So that's a great thing to do. Do you guys have any other questions? These are awesome questions coming in. Okay, someone says, Catherine says, my Merlin question was before you talked about it. Oh, okay. Thanks for your question, and thanks for being here, Catherine. Catherine's been sending me a lot of bird-related questions, so thank you, Catherine, for being here, and I hope you got something out of this. I hope everyone got something out of this tonight, so.
Thank you so much, Hilary. That was fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks, boss. Maria says, thanks. I definitely need to attend the Raptor one next week. So yes, so email me to sign up if you want to sign up for that Raptor one. A lot of you did already sign up for that. So if you already emailed me, you're good. But the Raptor one should be really good. It's with the Raptor Center, and they are the authority, local authority on raptors and identification. So yes, email me, Maria. I hope I'm saying your name right.
You are.
Awesome.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, it's so nice to finally interact with you. I can't see your face, but we've emailed so much, and it's so nice to.
You know, it's fun to hear your voice and get to know you a little better. Someday we'll meet.
Awesome. Maria is a big time birder in the Teton Valley, so we've engaged a lot.
Thank you.
Okay. people are just being nice and not asking questions. So thanks for the kudos. And Anna, it's so good to see you on too. Oh, cute. I just gave Anna a nature mapping training, so she's trained up. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. I'm going to close out the meeting so I can go eat dinner.
Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks everyone, and have a great night.